when I'm writing a story, I'll try to go to the place. It's intangible, but you do get a sense of what it looks like, what it smells like, how people talk, how they interact, all of those little details which a computer can't capture. It can't exist socially as a human
Mm-hmm.
does. By definition, it's a machine.
Welcome to another episode of the AI Purity Podcast, the show where we explore the intersection of artificial intelligence and the pursuit of truth. I'm your host, Patricia, and today we have a very special guest joining us. He is no stranger to the world of investigative journalism with a keen focus on pressing issues such as food systems, climate, disinformation, and the environment. As a reporter and writer for Canada's National Observer, his dedication to uncovering the truth has earned him numerous accolades, including a Webster Award nomination for environmental reporting in 2021 and recognition from the Canadian Association of Journalists for his work on disinformation. Today, we'll talk about his experiences, insights, and expertise as we explore the evolving landscape of journalism in the age of artificial intelligence. Join us as we unravel the complexities of AI-driven disinformation and the vital role of ethical journalism in safeguarding the integrity of information. Without further ado, let's welcome Marc Fawcett-Atkinson to the AI Purity Podcast. Hi, Marc. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you? That was quite the intro. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are so glad that you can join us today. We would love to get our audience to know you a bit better. Could you share your story of how you began your career as a reporter and writer and how you joined Canada's National Observer?
Okay. I'd say probably I started, a friend and I worked on a documentary. This would have been 6 or 7 years ago, covering water politics in New Mexico.
Mhm.
And that kind of got me hooked on reporting, talking to people, interviewing, kind of that exploration and curiosity, which led me to do a master's in journalism. And then shortly after, I started with the National Observer. And initially, I was covering food systems, climate related. So the National Observer, all of our work focuses on climate change. And I started off doing food related issues linked to climate, which then led me into plastic pollution and the petrochemical industry. And that kind of fed into disinformation in the last few years. So I still cover food, I still cover petrochemicals and toxins, but I've also kind of opened this wheelhouse of disinformation.
And these are all relevant issues that we should exactly be talking about today. And I wanted to ask you, like, what inspired you to explore the relationships between people and their social and physical environments, and how does this perspective inform your journalistic work?
I think it's hard to understand the world without looking at the relation. I guess I approach my reporting from a relational perspective. So I
Mhm.
think about, how are events, how are politics, how's our environment influenced by how we relate to each other and how we communicate essentially, and how kind of those dynamics play out. So I think, yeah, I've always kind of had an interest in those links, and then particularly in terms of the environment, like how do the ways that we relate to each other and that we understand ourselves in our environment kind of shape how our actions within it, I guess. Almost like geography. That's
Mhm.
probably the closest like academic discipline that I would have come from. Yeah, and in terms of like how that informs my reporting now, it's that's how I try to approach, I guess, the broad framework within which I try to approach, the questions of the environmental questions I'm writing about now is like, how do these different actors relate to each other?
And yeah, that goes right in with my next question about like how do you approach the storytelling aspect of your environmental reporting to engage and inform readers about critical issues without overwhelming them?
That's the eternal balance. Part of it, I think, is trying to find the story, like the narrative thread, which honestly in news can be a bit hard to do. So I'll try to see, is there kind of a story arc to the piece? Is there a flow to the information that feels natural in presenting it? Some of it is getting good at figuring out which information is relevant or not. And usually the way, and I do this both in my interviews and when I'm writing, is I try to approach it from the perspective of someone who doesn't know anything.
Mhm.
Uh,
That's a great
and I
perspective to
start
come
that,
from.
yeah, exactly. And I start that process at the interview level usually. I'll ask questions that I know the answer to. And I know the other person knows that I know the answer to, often if it's, say, an environmental organizer, or even an academic. But I want them to kind of articulate what the concept is or the argument is that they're making in a really clear way, because then I can go and say, okay, this is A, shaping how I'm going to write the story, but also like I can actually use that quote in the piece and have them explaining what they're trying to say and kind of what this context is. And in terms of writing, it's a lot of it, like I have really good editors. But yeah, a lot of it is just kind of trying to simplify, and not simplify, but like figure out what's the core issue or the core question at play. And I think part of it is just experience to some
Mhm.
degree and reading a lot of other news
Mhm.
stories about what I'm writing about and other, like just anything. And you kind of get a sense of like, oh yeah, that's relevant, that's not. And even like in terms of the writing, I'll try to take out adjectives. I'll try to take out like excessive words to just
Mhm.
really try to simplify it down to, what am I trying to say? Why does this matter?
Mhm.
Who cares about it? Why should they care?
Why should they
Really?
care?
Yeah.
Amazing. And you talked about this briefly earlier, about how you got started in environmental issues and reporting. But what drives this focus for you today? And what significance do you believe these topics hold in the broader context of your journalistic work?
I think for me, it's like I'm in Vancouver and looking out across at the mountains, and there's almost no snow. So I think to some degree, the answer is right there.
Uh-huh.
It's, we're in a climate crisis, and
Hmm.
the
Absolutely.
weather is erratic. And right now in BC, it's too warm, and we're looking ahead at a pretty terrifying fire season and drought season. And then also my writing on, particularly on pesticides and toxins, has been scary, would maybe be the best word to use. Especially the more you write about it, the more issues there are. And there's a certain, I don't want to say, yeah, it's almost a frustration and an anger. So it feels like
Mhm.
a good way to kind of use the skills I have to expose and kind of highlight a lot of the environmental challenges that we're facing. So to some degree, I wouldn't say I'm an activist. I've never been an activist. I don't like protests.
Mhm.
I don't kind of take that super public
Mhm.
uh, approach, but I definitely have a conscientiousness and like yeah, a care for the world we're in. And it's also work that feels morally comfortable.
Mhm.
Um, like it does feel, even if it's small and
It's a
sometimes,
subtle activism, I would say.
yeah, and the results aren't necessarily measurable directly, but you hope at least that they're having some impact.
Absolutely. Well, I want to pivot a little bit about from environmental issues. We were talking about our social environments, and I don't think there's anything more relevant to our society right now than artificial intelligence, and that's what we really wanted to talk about today. AI Purity is a platform dedicated to AI text detection, which is why we wanted to, speak with journalists and see their perspective on, this issue. So I wanted to ask, how do you think AI is currently impacting the journalism industry, and in what ways do you see it influencing the way stories are researched and reported?
I think there's kind of two answers to that. One is in the journalism industry, I'd say particularly on the management end,
Mhm.
um, there's a push and an interest into seeing how it can substitute for reporters,
Mhm.
um, which raises two concerns for me. One is, the jobs and the labor aspect. And the other one is straight up accuracy. Like occasionally just for kicks, I'll go on to ChatGPT and put in a prompt. I actually did it today because I was looking for just a source. And I was like, oh, I wonder if it'll, generate something for me. And like
How was
there's
it?
there's two issues. One is that it does generate something that sounds accurate, but it doesn't cite anything. It gives me
Yeah.
no references, so I
Mhm.
can't cross-check it. And when I have, out of curiosity, asked it to write a news story, they're consistently inaccurate and false.
Mhm.
So I think aside from the labor issue and the fact that we do need skilled reporters who can verify information and articulate that information in a way that's not only like clear but also compelling. This is my other criticism of text-based AI, is that it just is boring.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's no verification or safeguard, none of the verification or safeguards that are kind of embedded in the editorial process are in an AI system, at least from what I've seen and kind of what I've experienced. And my other concern on the disinformation side is just people writing fake articles or using it to generate. And some of the experts I've talked to have said, a lot of this isn't, it's not that the AI will be coming up with new material or new disinformation. It's that you can increase the scale of what you're spreading exponentially, because instead of needing to have people actually writing the content or thinking up the content, you can have a machine do it and just kind of like blast it out. And whether that's on fake news websites, fake blogs, Facebook posts, whichever platform you have, it makes the scale exponentially bigger. And that, I think, is my other concern. That's not directly related to journalism per se, but more the kind of wider ecosystem or
Yeah,
information ecosystem.
yeah, I wanted to touch base on that as well because I wanted to get your perspective on, platforms, not necessarily news sources, using AI text generators in creating online content specifically. How do you think it'll affect the credibility and authenticity of information in general?
I think it'll make it a lot harder for people to filter the information and to know which information is valid. And partly because it'll just be more common, and partly because people will get used to it. So I think for me, the biggest responsibility and area in a way I see there is on the educational system, whether that's publics, honestly, it's like schools, and starting at a very young age to make sure that kids know how to filter information and know how to identify sort, which is like basic stuff. I learned this when I was in grade 6, or at least started to, and then it kind of continued through university. But like helping people be much more aware of how information can be generated and what blocks it or not. Yeah, I think will be key. But it's a bit of an unknown world, and it is rather scary. Just the amount of fake information that can be pumped out there. And like I said, a lot of it, social media already is pretty good at generating a pretty wacko stuff, even with actual people behind it. So it's not that the concept of verification is new. I think it's that you need to be much more attuned to it, and AI can be much harder to differentiate because it can imitate basic, it can imitate non-boring human writing pretty darn well.
Yeah, and like the more it's being used, the more harder it becomes to, decipher if it's like AI generated, human written. I mean, I feel like with anything, any content you see online, and especially for the younger generation, you said earlier, like when you were in sixth grade, you could already tell. I totally agree with that, but I don't feel like it's the same for the younger generation. I think they may be a little more susceptible to believing fake news. So that's why we come on here and like try to be the platform to teach people about how can you spot these types of content that are AI generated? How can you decipher what is truth and what isn't? And so I wanted to ask you, could you share your thoughts on the ethical considerations surrounding the use of AI in journalism or just in general text generation, particularly in the context of preserving the integrity of information and combating disinformation?
From my perspective, there's kind of two aspects to that. One is on the reporting end. I think and I don't know what this would look like, because journalism isn't a regulated, I wouldn't say regulated industry, but it's not like engineers or lawyers who need to pass a test and there's kind of a college regulating it. We're really working based on our, each company's journalistic standards and practices and kind of the broader ecosystem of journalistic practice and ethical journalistic practice. So I think there's a responsibility if you do use AI, to be very transparent about it and to always, always, always verify it. Like I do think there is a space for it as a tool. Occasionally I'll use it to just like get into the writing mode. If I'm just having like blank page fear and I can't get going, I can kind of kickstart that process. But then once I'm in, like I'm writing and I need to be, I'm verifying all the information and I'm not copy pasting it essentially. It's one tool out of other tools in the toolbox. But it can't be kind of a substitute for your verification work, and honestly, your writing work and kind of your craft work as well. Like another example I'll use there is I use Otter AI, which is a transcription service, often because it just accelerates my work speed by like 8 times. Instead of needing to hand transcribe, I can get a transcript in 30 seconds, right? So that there is like an example. It's a very, very useful tool, but it's not writing the stories for me. It's one element of that process. And then the other angle to that is whether, and I think like, New York Times recent pushback on AI using its material, I think is a really interesting development. Like I agree with their pushback on this because what we generate is valuable and it's intellectual property. And, there's a reason that we ask people to either donate or subscribe, like in the case of National Observer, to subscribe to read materials because it costs something to produce. And I think allowing AI to just draw from the material we produce and then essentially plagiarize it also brings up a lot of moral and ethical and labor issues as well. So that's kind of the other angle to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what do you think? Like, how can journalists navigate this evolving landscape where there's a world now of AI-driven disinformation? And how do we ensure accurate reporting to counteract the potential influence of false narratives in public perception?
As the journalist, educating yourself as much as possible on whatever it is you're writing about with actual people who are experts in it, or reports or peer-reviewed research. But usually, for me, the experts and peer-reviewed research are my two go-tos, so that I know enough about the context to be able to say, okay, this doesn't really make sense. Um, and yeah, and then also in my work, citing those same kinds of sources. Definitely, it's pushed me to rely much more on peer-reviewed work and and direct interviews with people who, and none of this is new. Like journalists have been doing this for ages, um, but I think it puts an even bigger emphasis on the need to do that and to have that verification process. Yeah. And when you have a newsroom with the resources, like the fact checking process that magazines would use, for instance, is great because then you have even more sources and you have another person going through and checking everything. Uh, it depends on what kind of news organization you're in, whether that's possible or not. Um, but kind of at least taking some of the rigor and the standards from that and bringing it into your work, I think.
Yeah, highlighting direct sources as you've always done. I think that'll really, set the tone and make the difference. If you see an article that doesn't have any references or citations, I mean, that'll be a very obvious sign that this might be an AI generated content. So, um, thank you for that. And do you believe that the deployment or development of AI detection tools like AI Purity is essential to fight against disinformation? And how might these tools, you think, contribute to maintaining online integrity?
I think they're an important part of the picture for sure. And one thing that I have noticed with them is I'm not enough of a tech person to know how either the AI works or the
Hmm.
AI detection works,
Hmm.
right? So having I think for me personally, what helps inspire the trust in the AI detection is having a knowledge of how that is actually figuring out whether a text is AI generated or an image or whatever it is that content you're looking at is AI generated or not. Um, just kind of a basic understanding of how that process works. But it's definitely like I said, it's another tool in the toolbox that I think is super useful because in the same way that AI scales the amount of information that can go out there, detection tools can help scale the speed at which you can look through the information and flag issues that you then go and through kind of a more rigorous fact checking process. But it helps with that kind of initial
Hmm.
scanning. Is kind of how I see it playing in. Um, it makes me think too of professors and like scholars who are trying to make sure their students aren't plagiarizing.
Hmm.
Again, it's like a helpful tool to catch that, but I think that the idea that that's the only standard that you use to decide whether someone's plagiarizing or not can be a bit of a complicated ground because you do want to dig a bit more and see, what's going on, where's this material coming from, what does, in the case of like a student, what does the person say to it or not, and like use some of those human skills, I guess, to make the final decision. So yeah, it's a tool. And like thinking about it in terms of a tool, I think is the way to go about it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like you said, it is a tool. It's not anything that can replace human ability to make that sort of judgment by yourself. I mean, the way AI text detectors work is quite similar to AI generation, where it like has a database of everything that's been written, which is why, like you said earlier, it's very easy to plagiarize already existing bodies of work, especially if it's online, because that's where AI takes that from. So if they can see that it has been written somewhere else, then it can say they pretty much look for the perplexness and burstness of the sentences. So basically, like the way humans would write sentences would not be the same as a computer. So they can like tell those little like subtle things, so it is a tool. It's not something you can, I think, personally completely just use that as a basis. But like you said, it is very, very helpful and easy, but you have to still do the work, I guess, and just make your own assessment and judgment to completely know what you're reading, if it's correct or not.
And I think the scale question is big for me. Like
Mhm,
there's just on both ends of like the internet has allowed so much material to be at your fingertips that
mhm.
it's just you need a tool to help work through all of this.
Just to like make the process like faster, but like you said earlier with using transcription tools, right? It just makes everything easier, especially with like the amount of like stuff that's out there. You can't really like go through all of it all at once, or like at least if you want to save some time, that's where it becomes a bit handy using AI tools, I would say.
But even like not this isn't an AI tool per se, but that the piece I did that you mentioned that I got an award nomination for, we used a web scraper for
Mhm.
Facebook posts that
Mhm.
scraped every Facebook ad on political issues in Canada for I think a year or something. And
Mhm.
that allowed links to emerge that would have been possible to see otherwise, but it would have taken 3 weeks,
Mhm.
a month to actually do all of that manually. Whereas the scraper did it in, I don't know, 3 days or
Wow.
something, 2 days. Yeah.
I think they use maybe similar technologies like machine learning and stuff like that. But yeah, like let's use these like tools as they are, but not necessarily using that all the time, especially for creating content. So let's talk a little bit more about it, your investigative reporting and some ethical challenges. As a journalist covering a broad spectrum of topics, how do you balance in-depth investigative work with the need for timely reporting on rapidly evolving issues?
I think that's every journalist's existential question. Um, I'm lucky with the Observer that my role gives me a fair bit of time. Like, I don't have many breaking news stories. I don't really do breaking news. I'll have stories that are time sensitive and that do need to get published. But our approach is that we're not going to be beating the Canadian press on everything all the time,
Mhm.
because they have an entire staff whose job it is to cover breaking news or CTVs.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a slightly different thing. Where I see my work fitting in is more of a bit more depth, a bit more analytical, a bit more investigative, kind of digging into stories. Yeah, so there's kind of in terms of the news end, that's probably where I see myself fitting more, is like slightly following up on breaking news with more depth and more complexity.
Mm.
Like one example that comes to mind is a few weeks ago I did a piece about a gas leak at a refinery in Vancouver that like sent, or in Burnaby, that sent a huge gas cloud all over the city. And like plenty had been written about it in the Sun and CBC, but I wanted to do a piece, yeah, looking at it a few, like 2 weeks later, what information had come out, and no one had really kind of done that follow-up work.
Mhm.
So in terms of the news, that's kind of where I see myself in it. And then that allows time for investigations because you have a bit more flexibility. Some of it's also just time management to balance between more newsy stories and more investigative stories. If there's a really big investigation, my editors will let me work on that more to prioritize it. Yeah, so it's just kind of balancing
Mhm.
essentially. And there's also ebbs and flows in the news cycle. Like there'll be really busy periods where you need to focus more on more immediate issues. And then there'll be 2 weeks where not much happens and you have time to do other stuff. So
So in your investigative work, how do you ensure the accuracy and the reliability of the information you gather, especially when dealing with issues prone to misinformation?
the same process as I was describing earlier is I'll rely a lot on experts in the field and peer-reviewed work. Occasionally, I'll use government reports sometimes. Um, I'll use reports that they might not be peer-reviewed, but they'll be like environmental organization reports. But even then, I take those with a grain of salt usually, because they obviously have a bent to it. But yeah, again, it's finding where you can get reputable sources and leaning on that to at least contextualized.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that everything needs to be coming from there. Particularly if you're looking also for a story arc, you might find a really good character that you trace through, but you need to check what they're saying against other sources, essentially.
And have you encountered instances where AI has been used to manipulate information or narratives? And how can journalists counteract that potential of misuse of AI in shaping public perception?
I think if there was anything I've written about where it was really obvious. I don't think I've yet covered any stories where it's been obviously AI, like AI was obviously used
Mhm.
to generate misleading content, or at least that I could tell
Mhm.
as journalists. And if I were to encounter that, I think I'd approach it from a perspective of, going back to those basic verification systems is, how does this information line up with stuff that I know to be accurate? And how does this compare when cross-referenced? And who is using the AI would also be, if you can figure that out, which you can't always.
Mhm.
Um, I've noticed a lot of the disinformation reporting, you'll have front websites or you'll have kind of it's hard to figure out who's pushing it, which is in and of itself a red flag.
Mhm.
Because you're like, if you can't identify the author, you can't verify the author, could be anyone. And yeah, and even that, like I know I haven't had this happen, but I have definitely seen cases. A colleague of mine in Victoria had one of his stories directly lifted by a AI powered news outlet in the States, I
Oh.
think, or in
Mhm.
Canada. And it was lifted, essentially copy pasted onto their website and given a fake journalist's name as the byline. And he figured it out and they eventually managed to get it down.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, like that would be a case. You just Google the person who wrote it and are they an actual person or not?
Mhm.
Which sounds obvious to do, but you don't necessarily do that, right? So I
Yeah.
think it's just being more careful and more thorough.
Absolutely. I mean, as a journalist, you said you do make these like verification, you do have these verification processes, but like the regular reader might not. Do you have any more of those types of advice that they can like use when they're reading news sources online that, they should raise their be like a red flag or something?
I think that for me, if you're just, and even for me when I'm just reading, not for work, just like I'm just reading online,
Mhm.
like the kind of questions I'll ask myself is like, does this make sense in the context of what else I know? And the kind of broader, again, kind of going back to that relational question and environment question, like, how does this piece of information or this story fit into the broader context of what I know? And if it works, then like, okay, it doesn't mean that it's fully accurate, but maybe it's particularly if there's other signs in it,
Mhm.
like it's citing sources that you recognize, for instance, then like, okay, or even that it has an interesting structure. That could be another one for me is like if it's well written and it reads with a voice, like you can sense that there's an authorship behind it.
Mhm.
Um, doesn't mean that it can't be AI, of course, but it has a bit more texture and personality and gives me a bit more of a sense of, okay, there's actually a person. And then, yeah, like if I'm really not sure, I might Google, just straight up Google, the author or the source or verify it. Yeah, essentially. But I guess it's a combo of just being aware and gut feeling to
Yeah.
some degree.
Well, considering the speed at which information spreads on the internet, how might AI contribute to the rapid creation of propagation of disinformation campaigns?
I think, like I said earlier, it can increase the amount of material
Mhm.
that can be sent out. Yeah, that's probably the biggest. It can increase the speed and the volume of material that can be published. Like it's not going to come up of its own volition with a disinformation campaign. At least maybe it could. I'm sure some people would argue that it could. The more likely scenario I've heard from experts I've talked to is that it just allows the scale to be much bigger and much faster.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think that's where I see it.
Well, you do have a focus on like environmental issues, right? Have you ever, because there's a lot of people who don't necessarily believe in climate change. Do you think they would ever leverage these types of AI tools to spread that type of disinformation, or have you seen that personally?
Oh, they totally would. That I'm aware of personally, I haven't. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean I haven't in practice.
Hmm.
The prime example that comes to mind is I was talking to a researcher who studies fossil fuel disinformation, and he's like, yeah, fossil fuel companies could totally just use AI to put out a bunch of content,
Hmm.
whether that's on Facebook posts, comments, fake blogs, and then
Hmm.
that gets kind of wrapped into the broader ecosystem. I can't think of any examples where I've directly encountered it that I know of. It's come definitely on my radar, and I'm looking for it because it would be a great
Hmm.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the journalist side, how can they respond to these like types of challenges where AI-driven technologies are used to rapid dissemination or amplification of misleading information?
I think the biggest thing is highlighting it, exposing that it is happening,
Hmm.
putting out what's accurate and what's true, but also saying this is an event that's happening. This is a something that you need to be aware of,
Hmm.
um, as a person interacting in in the world. And you need to be aware that even sometimes the people that you see posting that you think are people aren't actually people. So again, it kind of goes back to that awareness question. And
Hmm.
in terms of the responsibility of journalists, it's really highlighting that this is a possibility, that this is happening, that this is part of the information ecosystem, and people working in that space, or just reading the news, or kind of browsing around on the web or on TikTok or wherever, I need to be aware that that's possible. In the same way that, like, the conversation around deep fakes, like
Yeah.
deepfake videos, it's led to talks about regulatory measures, and I think that is needed to some degree with written material as well. But even the fact that it's a possibility helps be aware and a bit more cautious, I think, at least for me.
And do you think these AI generated misinformation articles would eventually impact the public trust in journalism? And if so, what measures do you think should be taken to mitigate that effect?
I think they could, along with non-AI generated disinformation
Hmm.
materials. Again, it's a question of scale, is how I see it, which again comes back to, I think, the same answer as this question I think journalists have been asking ourselves for definitely since the Trump years, is how to regain public trust. And for me, the answer to that is being much more clear as to where I'm writing from. Yeah, I think there's kind of two answers. One is, just being accurate with sources and citing essentially. And then also, acknowledging that I'm writing from a certain position, and I am a person. I'm not like an objective robot. And this is a discussion that's been happening in journalism circles for several years now. Is this I kind of idea of the journalist that is a objective observer is slowly getting dismantled and being replaced with the idea of an observer who sees from a certain position, but that doesn't mean you can't be accurate about what you're seeing and reporting. You just need to acknowledge that you are approaching it from a certain position. I don't even want to say perspective, but you also come at it with a background and knowledge and an approach, and it's a question of kind of acknowledging that public facing persona and work, in the work itself, citing, and also to some degree having a good story.
Hmm.
um, like, I
Yeah.
think if it's
Original
a true
stories. Yeah. News
yeah, if it's a
stories.
true original story that like talks to people, right?
Hmm.
And that can incite, that's going to resonate much more with people who might not be as convinced than a bunch of facts, which they might just write, outright right away. But I wouldn't say it's easy by any means. Like writing about, I've done a few stories around conspiracy theory groups, and what I found talking to some of these people is, they're great, they're very nice people, and we in many ways had similar concerns around some big issues like environment and economic fairness. It's just that we'd get to a point in the conversation, particularly around climate change, where our baseline facts they were like in another universe from a scientific fact. So it's hard to I don't know. I read Naomi Klein's Doppelganger book recently, and she describes that feeling very well. It's like a mirror world, right?
Mhm. Well, we're talking about like more of the negative sides of like AI, and it's being used to spread misinformation. On the flip side, how do you think? Because I feel like with enough discussions, we can like tip that, and hopefully we can use AI in a more ethical way. How do you think AI technologies can be leveraged to counteract the spread of false narratives? And what do you think are the collaborations that journalists and the people behind this technology can do together to tip that point?
Again, it comes back to that question of scale. Like the AI, or to counter AI tools, I don't even know what to, because presumably the counter AI tools are also using AI, right?
Yeah, they do
Um,
actually.
so, but the counter disinformation tools, I think it allows journalists to cover much more ground and get a much better sense of what's happening across the entire information ecosystem, or more of it, than if you're your own person, or even to think outside of, like, if I'm thinking to social media,
Mhm.
what would be ideal would be to be able to see outside my algorithm driven bubble.
Mhm.
Right, which you can do to some degree by just making a fake account and liking stuff that you would never like.
Mhm.
But it would be awesome. Like one story that comes to mind is I did a piece recently about this kind of front group linked to the Canadian Gas Association, and promoting natural gas over alternate like electric and more sustainable alternatives. And the way that they came to mind is they were running ads in CBC and the New York Times on the apps, like through a third party ad provider. And I didn't get any of the ads because I live
Mhm.
in the wrong part of Vancouver and I'm
Mhm.
too young. But my editor, who lives in another part of Vancouver and is older, was getting them for like 3 or 4 days. So having a system where I'd be able to look at the entire kind of Canadian ad ecosystem and figure out where these are being run and who's being targeted would be amazing. I don't know if that's would be possible, but like that is definitely one tool that would come to mind, because then you can say, look, this group that I found has links to this industry, but it's like kind of hiding it, is targeting these types of people in these sorts of environments and platforms. And yeah, like exposing that essentially. But doing that as an individual is nearly impossible because I
Mhm.
can't be, a million people at once,
Mhm.
or a million social media profiles at once.
Yeah, I actually did want to pivot towards social media, and ask you, I mean, considering the evolving nature of online media consumption, how do you see AI influencing the creation and distribution of news content, and what implications does this have for traditional journalism?
It allows a broader, I think, form of creation of social media content. Yeah, it makes it harder to figure out who's who,
Mhm.
essentially. It kind of takes the ability to be anonymous and hard to trace that already exists on social media and amplifies that, essentially. So I think, and can also then inform, which topics are trending, which videos or posts or tweets or whatever piece of content you're looking at get amplified or not, because they're in a way working the algorithm, right? And in terms of what that means for traditional journalism, I think it goes back a bit to the question of like, what does social media mean for traditional journalism? But again, on steroids to some degree, because of that scale question. And it's like how I think social media is an environment that is definitely worth investigating and is worth kind of looking at as a sphere that's influencing how we act in the world and how we kind of think about the environment. In my case, the environment and climate change, and and politics and food.
Towards my next question, how do you think the integration of AI in newsrooms, and you can let us know at the scale of which it's comfortable to use AI in Canada's National Observer, for example, even as simple as using ChatGPT, how do you think this might affect the relationship between journalists and their audiences, especially in terms of transparency and accountability?
At the National Observer, we're still figuring out an AI policy. So for the
Hmm.
moment, we're not using it to generate stories.
Oh, yeah,
Like I
absolutely.
use
Yeah.
it occasionally to maybe start writing or like a bit of research, but I would never publish, like have
Absolutely.
ChatGPT write a story and publish it. Like absolutely not.
Hmm.
I think for reputable news outlets, the key is going to be if you do decide to use AI, which comes with issues around accuracy, like I've mentioned, and eloquence, and also on the labor end, like labor questions and whether journalists have jobs or not,
Hmm.
and whether you have enough staff to actually be able to verify what's being published,
Hmm.
which I think are significant issues as well. It really comes down to being transparent and saying, we used AI or AI contributed to developing this piece. And I've definitely seen that I think in some academic papers, I've noticed they'll cite the fact that AI has been used.
Hmm.
And some reporting, I have seen that on occasion.
Hmm.
So I
And
think
that's a
that's really going
great
to be the
thing.
key.
Yeah. I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like they should be very transparent with that. And thank you for letting us in on that in the National Observer. I mean, but and I wanted to ask you that question because I've heard and seen news stories where they would be like AI reporters. I don't know if you've heard of that. They're trying to slowly integrate that. Like, I think they started with like AI news, sports reporters.
Yeah.
So that's like a little start. But yeah. What do you think about that? I mean, because you're talking about like labor issues and the fact that it could be, it's like a touchy subject. I don't think it's a possibility, or at least we're very far from it. But I mean, with, for example, the one I cited earlier with like AI sports reporters, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's where I see it coming in. Honestly, in terms of the news industry, that's where I see it hitting the hardest is on areas like sports reporting or daily news reporting
Hmm.
or kind of easy content generation.
Yeah.
It would be relatively easy to gather the basic information and get the AI to write something, and the format doesn't need to be particularly enticing. The whole point of it is to spread information and to share information. So I see that's kind of where in the industry I see it being the most likely to really see almost fully AI written stories and where I think the threats to jobs are. The issue
Mhm.
is you don't necessarily know it's accurate, which goes back to what I said right at the beginning. And B, in terms of a labor side, that those starter jobs are like how people start.
Mhm.
Like that's how you get into the industry.
Mhm.
And some people love it and stay in it their entire careers. But definitely those kinds of breaking news pieces or sports pieces or kind of shorter, easier stories are how a lot of the industry kind of gets going. And also in terms of local news, you can't really, and this is what I found working in smaller newsrooms before I was at the Observer. If you're in a small town, a lot of your reporting is really going to come from knowing people and talking to
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
And what's going to resonate with your audience, because it's a local audience, are very specific, localized details or characters or facts, even that like are fit to meet the needs of that publication or outlet. And AI just can't do that
Mhm.
because it doesn't live in a place.
Yeah.
It doesn't know a place in the sense that a person who interacts and lives within a social environment knows a place,
Mhm.
essentially. Or even like a physical environment. That's always why when I'm writing a story, I'll try to go to the place because you get a sense of it. It's intangible, but you do get a sense of what it looks like, what it smells like, how people talk, how they interact, all of those little details which a computer can't capture because
Mhm.
it's a computer.
Yeah. It'll never have that perspective as the human does.
No, and it can't exist socially as a human
Mhm.
does because it by definition it's a machine.
Mhm. Well, in your opinion, what role does media literacy play in mitigating the impact of AI-driven disinformation? And how can educational initiatives better prepare the public to critically assess information in the digital age?
I think it's key personally. Like I think, like I mentioned earlier, educating people on how forms of tools are out there to generate content,
Mhm,
like even knowing what's possible,
mhm,
and making sure that they know what's possible as those tools evolve and update because they're changing quite quickly. And then really teaching a lot of the, honestly, to some degree, basic skills of information verification. Looking back to peer-reviewed work over the random thing you found on a quick Google search, talking to people that are specialized in this, who've researched it, talking to people who are validated by the rest of their community or colleagues. Of course, there are pitfalls with that. If you're in the conspiracy world, you can get an entire alternate reality that is validated by itself,
mhm.
but it doesn't track up to what you see in outside your window. um, so I think there's a bit of caution there, but really to me it comes down to just basic media literacy to some degree, which I think we've known how to do this for a long time, and we've known how to teach it for a long time. If anything, one of my bigger concerns is underfunding schools, underfunding
Yeah.
universities, and putting people kind of socially in a situation where they can't necessarily afford to look at this. And again, I have a bias here because I did do a liberal arts degree and I'm an arts person, but like having funding and having kind of a society that allows people to explore history, to explore anthropology, explore sociology, explore political science, even if it's not what they don't make their career there, but to have kind of a rounded arts background, I think is helpful to be able to develop those critical thinking skills. And that is where we've, in Canada and in the States, significantly in recent decades. And, both at the public school system level and at the university level.
And with the potential for AI to automate the generation of deceptive narratives, and you talked about this earlier, like regulations, do you think there is a need for increased regulation or ethical guidelines to govern the use of AI in content creation, particularly in the news and information space?
Yes, on both fronts. I'm always a bit skeptical of industry, like purely industry driven guidelines on anything,
Mhm,
um, whether that's AI or plastic reduction
mhm,
or grocers not backstabbing each other. The last two are examples I'm kind of drawing from
mhm,
Canada. So no, I think, within the industry, we definitely need guidelines to at least frame how individual newsrooms and how individual reporters can think about how to use the AI in their work or not. And that they can then say, I'm following this code of conduct. Here's, where the rules are. Here's how it was developed. And I think, that is helpful too for, making us seem more legit or making us more legitimate in an audience's eyes. In terms of regulation, to me, there's kind of two areas that really strike me. One is the copyright question and whether AI can just outright steal your work and publish it under another name, whether
mhm,
that's the machine doing it or someone telling the machine to do it. I think that's a significant issue just in terms of the media's viability as an industry. And then also, I think we need regulation to ensure that that there's a system to make it so that it's transparent and easy to find what is AI generated or not. Not necessarily, I don't want to ban it. I'm
mhm.
not
Yeah.
in favor of that, obviously, but being able to say this was generated with AI or this was not generated with AI is, I think, a key tool in terms of that information filtering. And that is definitely where regulations can come into play, is to put that requirement for transparency in. And I noticed this, a parallel example I notice is with social media when I'm reporting on social media. And, Facebook, for instance, is transparent. It has, transparency rules that it supposedly adheres to, but there have been several times when I've tried to identify information based out of ads that are being run, like say the person running the ads, how much they're spending. And sometimes you can get it, sometimes you can't.
Mhm.
And there isn't really a solid system for recourse and there isn't a legal requirement for them to be more transparent. So I think, yeah, just even those kind of basic, they aren't very it's not a very complicated idea. It's, just making sure that companies are transparent about where their material is coming from and how it was generated is really key in my mind.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the challenges in like regulating these types of use of AI tools, especially in journalism, is that we might not even get a consensus. We might not even get like a global regulation. Like you said earlier, journalism isn't necessarily something that's regulated or like, other industries might be. So I think that's like a big challenge to that because, like, for example, like the National Observer, you're not really integrating AI, but like I said earlier, some news sources are integrating AI. So I think that in itself is a great challenge. Um,
Yeah, like I think you can focus on it from the journalistic end, but you can also focus on it from the AI end. Do the companies who run these platforms, like say ChatGPT, do
mhm,
they have a responsibility to make sure that their content is labeled as AI when it goes out into the world? So essentially, shift that responsibility question, or even, require some, I don't know if this is possible, but like require some form of tag
yeah,
on that information. So you can't actually lift it
yeah,
without it, almost like a meta, like in photos, you'll have metadata
yeah,
um, to have a requirement that that information is transparent, even if it's not, to the reader just going quickly through something, it might not be the most obvious. Ideally, it would be, but to at least be able to verify it if you have like basic computer and research skills.
yeah. I agree. It's definitely something that needs to be discussed more, and that's why we have this platform, and that's why we love to talk to different people from different industries and see how AI is impacting their industry. To have these like discussions and be more open and see what we can do because everything is like changing. It's all very new. So we don't really know how to navigate it just yet, but it's really important, I feel, to have these types of discussions. I wanted to ask you just a few last questions about the future of journalism and AI. From your perspective, how do news organizations need to adapt to the changing landscape of journalism, considering the influence of AI and evolving reader expectations?
I think step one is acknowledging it, which a lot of newsrooms are doing. I think from a business perspective, it's really doubling down on what do journalists, more to the point, offer in terms of verifying information, and really kind of driving home that point of we're trained and skilled in verification. Like this is literally what we do all day, every day for work. um, so emphasizing that, and even as individual journalists, going back again to that objectivity question, I think, at least for me, as a reporter, it is kind of acknowledging a certain positionality from where I'm writing from, and not having that define all of my work, but at least acknowledging that I'm not kind of a disembodied voice up in the ether. I'm actually a person.
Mhm.
And I think to some degree being quite aggressive in, I wouldn't say necessarily pushing back, like, yeah, pushing back against it where it's due, like in the case of lifting and copyright infringements, and really differentiating our product, yeah, from a business perspective, like our product from AI generated product, and like saying why this matters. Yeah, that's kind of how I see it. But it's not a clear, particularly in the broader context of, say, like the current conservative leader actively undermining faith in reporters
Mhm.
or Trump. That's, it's definitely an uphill. I wouldn't even say an uphill battle. It's definitely a battle.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I wanted to ask you just like one last question before you go, and this will be a bit more general, just about the future of journalism and AI. Like, how do you see that happening? Do you think it's an inevitable thing for AI to be integrated into newsrooms, not necessarily for content generation, but just to, help with fact checking and, streamlining that process? How do you see the future of journalism and AI?
I don't think anything's inevitable about AI because it's a technology, and ultimately we choose as a society whether to use a technology or not.
Hmm.
Um, the idea that, and this is one thing that capitalism is very happy to push, is this idea that that development and new technologies are inevitably going to be adopted, and that people are definitely going to go for an easier option, but that's also shaped by the regulatory environment and what's possible or not, and the cultural environment too. In terms of whether it's being used, like I already use AI in my work all the time. Like I use Otter. So I think it's already kind of integrated to some degree. And I do think that trend will continue in this specific context. And I don't think that's bad. It saves a lot of time. It can definitely help in some cases. It could even help with accuracy. In fact, like you said, like fact checking, as long as there's also a human behind the scenes controlling the technology and verifying it. Yeah. So I don't think it's in the short term anyways going away, but I do think there's a need for more oversight and regulation, particularly in content that's put out onto the internet, and transparency. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. This has been really insightful. Would you like to leave any parting words to our audience? Any advice,
Uh,
maybe something you'd like to share?
Check your sources, and also like invest in good journalism,
Mhm.
and like also focus on stories. Like
Mhm.
for me, that is how I got into this. And still, the most compelling pieces of reporting I read are good stories. And good stories with good characters and a nice narrative arc are always compelling, and they have been since humans were talking like humans, however, many million years ago.
Mhm.
And I think that fundamentally is like what, why a lot of us do this, and kind of what you should be looking for. Because a computer can't generate a good story.
Mhm.
Or I'm sure there are tech people out there who would disagree with me on this.
No, I agree
But
totally with
hold
you.
my ground
Mhm.
there. So
Absolutely. Well,
yeah.
this has been an amazing hour. Mark, thank you so much for being here with us and the time. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on another enlightening episode of the AI Purity Podcast. We hope you enjoyed uncovering the mysteries of AI generated text and the cutting edge solutions offered by AI Purity. Stay tuned for more in depth discussions and inclusive insights into the world of artificial intelligence, text analysis, and beyond. And until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep unmasking the AI.